Welcome back, everyone, to this next webinar in our series of webinars on techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment for carbon dioxide utilization. We have brought to you over the last few weeks work of the International CCU Assessment Harmonization Team in how we think about harmonizing ways in how we assess the readiness, the performance, and the overall opportunity for carbon capture and utilization technologies. We have now reached the fourth of a total of 5 webinars. And it's my pleasure today to introduce 2 parts of a set of presentations and discussions. We start with integration of techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment. A panel being led by Grant Faber. After an introduction by Katie Armstrong, we will hear a conversation between Anne Shem, Marcus Extubor, Stephen Mccord, and Ian Howell. This will take us about an hour, and then we move on to part 2 to hear from Nicole Mendoza and Jochen Weber about technology performance level assessment frameworks, especially for low TRL technologies in the CCUS industry. And with that, I'll hand it over to Grant.
Hi everyone, my name is Grant Faber. I'm a techno-economic assessment researcher with the Global CO2 Initiative. Welcome, I hope you're all excited to talk about LCA and TEA integration. I already got a cough. So I'm gonna hand it over to Katie Armstrong to present a few slides on integration, and then we're going to jump into our panel discussion.
Grant, I presume that's all fine and you can see the screen absolutely fine. Wonderful. So good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Katie Armstrong. I'm from the University of Sheffield in the UK, and I'm part of the group who's been looking at integration of LCA and TEA and social impact assessment as well. So I'm going to give you a brief overview on why we might want to integrate and think about integrating assessments. If you've looked at the guidelines that we've published, there are some principles in the general assessment principles of the guidelines about integrating assessments. We have made some changes between version 1 and version 1.1. As our research has evolved and our thinking has evolved, but this is still very much a growing area where we need to learn from each other, and that's why we're having a panel discussion like this today. So why do we want to integrate? Well, we need environmental and economic assessments to judge the potential sustainability of technologies, but also increasingly we should include social impact assessments into that too, because we want to develop technologies are sustainable in the long term. So what we're looking at is potentially creating this triple helix approach where we're interweaving environmental, economic and social impact assessment. And this can help us to find the optimal solution, because we all know it is not necessarily the best economic solution that is the most environmental, or vice versa. The most environmental solution can be crazily expensive and therefore not actually deployable. So why we might want to integrate is to find the optimal solution for the process. We might want to identify specific hotspots within that process and work out how we can improve them, or we might want to identify the optimal route for getting to a product, taking into account various different aspects. So there are a number of key themes that we want to consider. Purposes for doing an integrated assessment do vary dramatically, and therefore the level that we might want to integrate our assessments can vary a lot. And this is in no way to say one method of integrating is better than another method. They are just different approaches to achieve the goal that we have. So, for example, you can do separate reporting of your environmental, economic and social impacts. This can be done at various points in time, and then you can discuss the various linkages between them. As I mentioned before, you might want to do an integration to assess hotspots in a single process, comparing to an existing technology, and look at what happens if, to say, the economic indicators if you vary the process to make it better environmentally. You might want to be assessing for different alternative options and looking for different process design or product or feedstock applications. Or you might want to be performing a non-detailed screening type of comparison to work out what the best fit to the goal that you've got. So as I mentioned, there is no standard approach for doing this. There are lots of different ways that you can integrate your technology, integrate your assessments. One way can be by just publishing your LCA and TEA together and having a short discussion about the kind of results and how they would impact on each other. We can calculate combined indicators by taking environmental indicators, economic indicators, or even social impact indicators and combining those to find a numerical new indicator. Or we can include multi-criteria decision analysis approaches, which can lead us to optimizations or hotspot identifications. There are many, many ways you can do this. They're all valid, and you don't necessarily always need to do something complex. Integrating such assessments sounds complex, but in some, it can be as simple as you need it to be. What you also need to always take into account is the resources that you've got available to you, because integration is a further step on, obviously, from the LCA and TEA assessments we've generally been talking about. So you need to consider how much resource you have available to you. So very quickly, some key principles about integrating assessments. There's a DOI link to a paper that we've written on this subject. I'd advise if you want to know more about this, you follow that link. LCA and TEA can be seen as subordinate assessments in an integrated approach, where you take the results from the LCA and TEA and then use them to create an inventory for your integrated assessment. Your integrated assessment should have its own goal, and as within goal setting, it should be clear and detailed and unambiguous. As with an LCA and a TEA, the integrated assessment itself can be iterative, and so you can go round and round through the process. Now, I'm not going to expand any more upon this. You can find many more details in the paper about methodologies that we are thinking about for integrating assessment. But in summary, integration is at least the combination of two of life cycle analysis, techno-economic analysis, and social impact analysis. And it can really help drive decision making and helping you to come to some optimal conclusions when you have conflicting indicators. Integrated assessment does rely on a common inventory. You need common data, and it's also highly dependent on the purpose and why you want to integrate. It's very dependent on the data you've got available and the technology readiness level, which we'll hear about in the second half of today's webinar. So uncertainty can be compounded when you integrate LCAs and TEAs, dependent on the level of data. And also, it's very dependent on the amount of resource and time you've got available and what your goal is. So I'm going to leave it there. If you've got any questions, we'd love to hear them in the chat. I know that was a very quick and very brief run through about what integration is, but I'm going to give it back to Grant for a panel discussion, which will hopefully expound upon some of these ideas.
Very much, Katie. I think that was very useful context for our upcoming panel discussion right now. I also pasted the link as a clickable hyperlink in the chat, so if anyone wants to check it out there, please do so. So now I will introduce our panelists, and then we will go into about, I would say, 30-35-minute panel discussion, after which we'll have some audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, anything like that, feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or the chat to however you want to engage, and post those. And then at the end of our session, near the top of the hour, we will discuss those questions with the whole panel. But now I will introduce each of our panelists before we start. So first we have Ann Shim, who is the head of Advanced Materials and Systems Research at BASF, and she is also a member of the advisory board of the Global CO2 Initiative. Next we have Ian Howell, who is a home care science and technology director for advanced materials and surface science at Unilever, working on their Carbon Rainbow and Clean Future programs, which are very exciting, and we'll hopefully hear more about today. Next, we have Marcus Extevort, who is the Vice President of Energy and Climate at XPRIZE, where he works on the new $100 million carbon removal prize competition, which is very exciting. He also sits on the advisory board of the Global CO2 Initiative. And then finally, we have Stephen Mccord, who is a research associate and project manager at the University of Sheffield, where he works in developing techno-economic and life cycle assessment guidelines and case studies in partnership with the Global CO2 Initiative and our other collaborators. So welcome, and thank you to all of the panelists for attending today and being willing to talk about this. So the first question, and this is just going to be open to the whole panel, just for discussion, so we can really jump right into this. Can you speak to real, tangible examples of how you or your organization consider and possibly integrate economic and environmental attributes of products or programs or companies or whatever it is? So, yep, so I'm just going to open that up and let anyone kind of take that and just talk about some examples of integration.
Well, I'm happy to jump in and go first. So we're a little bit unusual at XPRIZE in that we're not manufacturing products, we're not retailing products, we're a non-for-profit, and we're organizing incentive prize competitions. However, for us, the assessment imperative comes in the form of, well, we're running competitions, which means judges need metrics, and techno-economic analysis and life cycle analysis in some form have been part of a competition we just wrapped, which is about CO2 utilization, and are certainly going to be part of competition for carbon removal. So the basic idea is a set of judges are going to be looking at technologies and demonstrated, in some cases, products, or in some cases, systems, and they'll be using TEA and LCA to form the basis of their analysis. And we can get into a bit more detail, but I'll just say very roughly, the way we approach this is to come up with the simplest but most rigorous way of forcing technology or product developers to conduct an assessment, either themselves or through a third party that we will arrange, and then have the judges ultimately make the decision using those data as inputs. In the Carbon XPRIZE, where we focus on products, we didn't do a TEA, but we had teams do a very rough economic analysis focused on the market size, rough profitability of their product. And we did conduct a thorough LCA. In the prize that we are launching now for carbon removal, it may or may not involve a lot of products per se, but the systems will be evaluated. We're kind of upping the bar on TEA. We will be diving a little more deeply there, and then trying to maintain standards on LCA. And in terms of integration, I'll just say too, we're trying to figure this out. We've done the sort of the simplest thing you could possibly do is just to say, well, we need to see all of this analysis. And what we'd like to do as a further step is to figure out, okay, well, which elements can be streamlined? Do we do a formal integration, or do we just keep them separate? That's actually actively something we're trying to figure out.
Cool. Well, hopefully there were some outputs of this talk today that maybe will help with that process. So yeah, anyone else with thoughts on this?
Hi, this is Anne from BASF. This is a really important topic for us. We do a lot of product improvement, product development, and research. And a criteria we have for every single product we develop and every single research project that we start is that it has to have a positive impact on the environment. And we measure it in many forms. It can be energy utilization for us or for our customers. It can be materials that are used, but it has to be a positive impact. It's very important for us. It's one of our pillars. For research projects, of course, we go even further. So there we're always looking for what can we do to use products from the biobase, for example, biomass products, or what can we do to really step further ahead in what technologies are going to be available for our product development in the next few years.
Can I build on that a bit, Grant, from the Unilever perspective? Good. So I was trying to think of a simple answer to your question, and how do we sort of do this in Unilever? And I think at the basic level, we operate what's called a multi-stakeholder model in Unilever, and I think that's where it all starts. So So we have to satisfy the needs of our consumers, and that might be that sort of products that we sell have to work. And so we have to make that evaluation. Is the product we're going to sell going to meet the needs of the consumer? We have our customer base who also have things that they need, our products to sort of meet their needs. There's the needs of the employees, the society, planet. So there's all these stakeholders that every innovation is trying to kind of meet the needs of. And so I guess at some level, it is by necessity, it's a qualitative assessment and hope that what you're doing is going to tick the boxes for all these different stakeholders. And then there's a more sort of quantitative approach, which is very much like Anne was just describing, that we have an innovation funnel, and every innovation right at the start is assessed on, is it going to meet the performance criteria that a program is set with, and what are those criteria? And then increasingly now is our clean future strategy. Well, of course, we always have to meet the safety criteria. There's a sort of fundamental, you can't hurt people, you can't hurt the planet, toxicity, all of those things are table stakes technologies. And then you move into the, okay, is this technology going to help us meet our net zero targets? Is it going to remove fossil carbon from our footprint? All of these things then add in. And so we have, and we sort of bring that together basically by bringing together our procurement team who specialize in economic decision making. We have our safety teams and our environmental teams who bring in the knowledge on safety, myself as a material scientist. And it really is quite often a robust, I think would be the polite word, conversation of people with different opinions and different values and different views, if you like, arguing out what's the right thing to do and what are the compromises and all the rest of it. And so it's a sort of qualitative decision-making process supported by lots of quantitative data, I think is probably where we're at.
Yeah, I suppose for our work, it's a little bit different in the sense that, as Katie mentioned, a lot of our work is research, and we're very much interested in the how elements of bringing together TEA and LCA, or just sort of environmental and economic assessment in general. One of the sort of advantages I feel that we have is that we have the time to do this research, but also we have contact with a large number of companies, whether this be SMEs all the way up to large multinationals, and we can see how they evaluate and assess themselves already. And I think that in terms of tangible examples, there are a lot out there without people even realizing that they are there. You know, when you discuss with technology developers, sort of the potential environmental impacts of picking option A or option B, one of the things that will come up is cost. So I think there's a link that's always there. Maybe it's not yet quite formalized in a way that allows you to make these comparisons across many different sectors or across many different situations. I think it's very, very situational, and I think there's definitely a need to try to formalize that and capture it a little bit clearer for people outside of that sort of decision that's been made. As Ian just mentioned, it seems to be that some people make these decisions in a group, but sometimes for the people that are outside the group, it may be a little bit more difficult to see why that decision's made. So there's two challenges, and sort of in terms of the real tangible side, I'd say it's the actual guidance of making a repeatable process, but also in making sure that anyone who needs to be aware of the decision can also follow how this has been done, and to make sure that there's enough alignment between that data to allow you to compare the two sides of the coin, almost the economic and the environmental.
Thank you all for sharing about that. I think it's interesting and helps kind of set the stage for where we're going next. So everyone kind of talked about uses of, it sounds like everyone was touching on uses of integration and how you might go about doing it. Something that we're kind of curious about at the initiative and in the International CCU Assessment Harmonization Group is that what kinds of like tools, research, articles, methods, anything like that would be useful for advancing how all of you do integration? Because as researchers, we're always looking for ways that we can make tools that can contribute to kind of the state-of-the-art practice for this. So Marcus, you had mentioned that this will hopefully be a part of the upcoming X Prize competition, for example. So like what kinds of things would help advance this? What are challenges everyone's facing, and what do you all think would kind of help you all process if you feel like you need help advancing it.
Can I take that one first? So from my point of view, somebody asked me a question in the chat about the carbon rainbow. And carbon rainbow is basically, for us in Unilever, how do we move away from virgin fossil carbon-based carbon as a feedstock for our materials to carbon from non-virgin fossil. So it could be anything else. It could be CO2, it could be biomass, it could be recycled chemicals. What that means is, if you look at our chemical portfolio, we've got hundreds and hundreds of chemicals need to be evaluated, and then all the routes that you might make those materials in the future need to be evaluated. And so the big ask we've got at the moment is, how do you do what we call quick scan? How do you very quickly do that back of the envelope thing that says, do this, don't do that, as a quick filter of all the thousands of options that you might have to consider, because you can't do, or we can't afford to do, or haven't got the time to do, a full LCA analysis, as Katie sort of said at the beginning, in depth on everything to enable us to make filtering choices. Ultimately, yeah, you get down to that level of quantification, but at the start, when you're just trying to make simple choices between very early technologies, we need these filtering quick scan tools. That's our biggest need. I have no idea what that means in practice.
Let me add on to that if I could. Yes, to quick scan tools. I think, where I sit, I have the luxury of being able to articulate who the stakeholders are. The stakeholder is me, basically, or like my organization, or specifically the panel of judges that evaluates projects. But we get to call the shots in the sense that we say, these are the most important things in this order, 1, 2, 3, 4. On the other hand, yes, access to quick scan tools is a huge need for us. It's something that we probably can't generate on our own. Just to tell a quick story. So when we launched the Carbon X Prize, we knew life cycle assessment was very important, and we had no idea how to do it. And we sort of crafted our own very simple methodology and asked practitioners to follow it. And then on another iteration and later in the competition, we worked with a third party to actually execute the analysis with sort of the innovators, which worked out really well. Now, in the prize we're doing now, we're in a similar situation. We have said publicly, we're going to look at something called fully considered cost. Does that mean every competitor is expected to do a thorough techno-economic analysis? Well, kind of, but we also go into this knowing that they probably don't have the capability to do that. So one project in front of us is to develop a simple cost framework. When I say cost, I mean how to assess cost at scale of an early stage technology that isn't quite at scale yet. And there are several people, I'm sure, in the audience that know how to do this. So a task in front of us for the next, say 6 months is to craft such a simple framework and then share it with innovators and say, do it like this, please, and see how that works. And again, so we embark on this, not exactly sure, or not quite having done that before, understanding that it's an important outcome, and we're going to try to push through and see if we can either have experts help us craft a tool or work with experts to develop some kind of a tool. But that's a project that we're working on right now.
Thank you for asking that question. It's a really good one. In BSF, we've done LCAs since the 90s. So we have a huge internal library of LCAs. But clearly, the society is moving, right? So now we're talking about integrating different aspects into these LCAs. And we have also worked on that. I think it's important that the broader, LCAs are complex. I think it's really important that the broader environment, broader society gets comfortable looking at these relatively complex analysis to be able to compare them. It's very important for us. We take a lot of pride in our research, take a lot of pride in our data. We put a lot of money into developing this information because it guides our decisions. And again, one of our pillars is we want to make our footprint on the earth smaller as we go forward with some requirements too about carbon neutrality. So as we go forward, I think it's really important that we have a way to communicate this outside of a corporation. What we practically do is we work very closely with our customers to make sure that we look at a whole value chain and not just one part of it. But again, different companies or different institutions might do it a little bit differently. because these things are so complex, it's easy to weight one thing a little bit more than the other. And so I think getting to a point where we can compare data, where we really have something that people trust outside a really deep dive knowledge into all the background that exists for an LCA, that would be a huge step forward and very needed, not just for us, but really for the society.
Thanks. Stephen, do you have thoughts on what Ian and Marcus were talking about in terms of quick scanning tools, or what Anne was just saying in terms of
Yeah, I suppose our interest is very much in developing these tools as opposed to anything else. And we have the luxury of working with people who want to use them, so we can get that feedback loop to be able to develop these things clearly. We also have the ability to start, as part of GCI, our ability to start our development from our own guidelines on TNT. And I think the place where we're at the minute is that we sort of see two parts to the whole integration element as one thing. We see there's a need for alignment and a need for combining. And the tools for sort of combining and making decision analysis have existed for quite a while. You know, multi-criteria decision analysis isn't new, and lots of people within that sort of business sphere are very comfortable with that. What we need is to make sure that the data that goes into making that decision is actually aligned at a more fundamental level. And there's a limit to how aligned you can make it, especially if you're going back to really low maturity. And that's a sort of challenge in itself, and one that we're looking at the minute. And we're very much, I suppose our focus at the minute is very much on that sort of aligning side. We trust that the combining side, which is, as I said, the decision analysis, and even to an extent the sort of combined indicators. You know, you can play around with your two economic your economic dimension and your environmental. You can pick out whatever pieces you want to try to look at things. You can look at your capital over time. You can look at your capital cost and your operational cost per unit of CO2 and design your risk profile around that. You know, if you want to have high capital costs and lower operational costs per ton of CO2, great, do that. Or if you want to go vice versa, great, do that. You know, these are all sort of decision tools that people in industry will have their own risk profiles for. Our main focus has been very much around that sort of first part of making sure that anything used in these decision analysis approaches is aligned enough for you to be able to make sense of it. So those costs are based on a similar sort of basis, on a similar time scale, things like this. You know, it's no good using environmental data from today and costs from 10 years ago, which is a problem for a lot of researchers in the fact that we don't always have access to up-to-date costs. So I think that's very much the challenge we see, and we see that there's a need for that type of tool. And we'd hope that if we can at least contribute to developing another generation of this is something that other people could take, refine and sort of build on for their own purposes and sort of tweak to fit their own needs almost. But yeah, our first and foremost, I suppose our biggest tool that we're looking for is the guidance of sort of making sure those things are aligned, or showing people how to align those things to minimize the risk of misalignment, which may risk sort of incorrect decisions being made further down that pipeline.
Thanks, Stephen. Something you just mentioned actually was something else I wanted to ask you about, which was you had mentioned that there are existing tools and methodologies for the combination aspect and the combining. Could you talk a little bit more about like what those are, and if someone is, say, completely unfamiliar with those tools, how can they learn more about them? Yeah,
so I mean, I will stick mainly to the tools that I'm aware of. Other people can add things in the chat as they like. But I mean, we have looked a lot at sort of multi-criteria decision analysis. There's two flavors here that can be very useful depending on where you are in that whole sort of product development cycle. You know, you can either take the attributional approaches, where you take the tools that help you pick from discrete options, and you can pick this based on as we said, the individual profiles based on your own preference of, is economics more important, or a specific part of economics? Is there a specific part of the environmental profile that is of great importance? Obviously in CCU, we put a lot of weight behind global warming potential and use of CO2. But there's lots of tools that have been around since the sort of 60s and 70s that allow you to do this in lots of different ways. The analytical hierarchy process is very famous. There's things like Electra. There are things like I said, there are a large number of tools. We have recently finished for GCI a worked example based on some of our workings, and the first part of that worked example actually reviews a number of these MCDA tools very briefly. And what I'd suggest is that anyone who wants to find out more should pick up that document and then look at the references more than the document itself, because they go into a lot more detail, and you can pick up the sort of advantages and disadvantages of these different attributional approaches. On the flip side, there's also the more sort of objective-based approaches where you may have competing design objectives. So if you're more involved in design, the attributional approach may be of less interest to you. Where you want to design for minimum cost as well as minimum environmental impact, and multi-objective the multi-objective approaches there are quite easy to find information if you go and sort of search the internet. It's something that we will cover more in version 2 of the guidelines, and it's something that we will talk about a little bit next week as well. But yes, there is a whole, as I said, there's a whole wealth of information on decision analysis, and these tools are not things that we plan to rewrite or try to rewrite. And I'm pretty sure that you could ask Marcus or Anne or Ian, they'll all have at some point in their sort of organizations familiarity with ways of making decisions. It's very much about making sure people can make those decisions confidently.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Hopefully people in the audience will record that, and hopefully someone can post that link to the worked example you were talking about just now. That's available, I believe, open access on Deep Blue if someone wants to post that, and if not, I'll post it in a couple minutes. But something I'm curious about too, so we've talked a lot about how integration involves balancing environmental impacts of products along with, say, the cost or the profitability potential. So what I'm curious is, especially in for-profit contexts where one of the missions that the corporation exists is to, of course, make money for investors and so forth. So how, in those contexts, do you navigate that integration, and how do you navigate that conversation when it comes down to a trade-off between externalizing an impact but making more money versus maybe using some alternative that's better for the environment but that's not as profitable? I'm really curious how that conversation gets had, and I think everyone's touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear some more about how that happens and how internal actors can maybe advocate for more consideration of environmental impacts and more integration of those into decision making.
Yeah, so I guess, again, I'm trying to think how to answer the question. So one sense is our business purpose is to make sustainable living commonplace. So for Unilever, I find it quite difficult to answer, because our strategy for the business is through making sustainable living commonplace. So it's kind of it's ingrained right into the corporate purpose. That's how we're going to make money for it. And an example of that is we've just done our climate transition plan, which has been sort of voted on by shareholders. So again, the kind of at that sort of fundamental level, the way that we are going to transition towards a net zero by 2039 company that meets all of our sustainability targets, we put it to the shareholder vote. So that's one, in a very simple way, that's one way how we we get that sort of feedback about, do people think we're doing the right thing or not doing the right thing, because the shareholders vote on it, which is new this year, but that's a huge step forward. I think, again, more granular when you get down to the sort of individual technology basis, the process I described earlier. There really is a very, to some extent, it comes back to the values of the people in the company, that there's a very open conversation about what are the consequences of this decision going to be, and it is a multifunctional brand, business, procurement conversation, backed up by the data, and it's. I can't really explain it more than that. You have to go and be in it to see how it works, but that's effectively how it works.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question too, and I liked how Ian answered that. It's in our strategy. Our strategy is our guide for what we believe is important, and because of that, it is part of every decision we make. So if you start with research, in research we have looked at our strategy and we said that there are certain things that are incredibly important for our future, for the future of everybody. And one of those things is sustainability. So we have research funding that only goes towards sustainability projects. And we actually subdivide that even further into different kind of sustainability, environmental sustainability. So that's the criteria to even start research, is it fits within that criteria of that particular strategic direction that we want to take. And then, of course, it has to be something that is also economically can carry itself. If you go further down into our business unit where we do more direct market interactions, again, every time we develop a project, excuse me, even before we really put money into the lab, when we first go to our president and ask for allowance to go ahead with a project, that is one of the considerations. Is this going to have a positive, sustainable impact for the world? And if not, then we just don't do it. We have, for a number of years, we have looked at our whole portfolio, and we have divided into things that makes the world better, keeps it where it is, and detract. And the detractors we have absolutely gone after, even if it's not economically an economic advantage to us. We've gone after all of them systemically to make sure that they get out of our portfolios as soon as we can. And because of that, it has shrunk to almost nothing over the last 30 years. So for us, it started with strategy, and you can see that going all the way through the company.
If I could just comment on that one really briefly as well. I'm not sitting inside a corporate, but what I'll say is that two things. One, we try to very much follow what people like Anne and people like Ian are doing, and make sure that we point innovators in the direction of what we think will make sense to these two as examples of possible future partners or scaling partners or customers of their product or technology. The second thing we think we can do as a non-for-profit is signal to the broader community what we think sort of the correct way to do this is and what incorrect isn't. So as an example, the boundaries of life cycle analysis when evaluating a CO2-based product. It's a very simple thing, setting the boundaries, but enforcing, for instance, gate to grave or cradle to grave rather than something a little bit more narrow, and saying, well, we are going to ask our competitors to do it this way because we think this is the correct method. Or the project we're working on now, this is what we think carbon negative means. We think this is an appropriate definition. We're going to use this definition, and sort of using whatever influence we have, encourage others to either challenge that method or adopt it and make it better and take it forward. So that's a minor role that a lot of organizations can play, but we see our role that way as sort of pointing to the right answer or the right method, so to speak, and then being ready to adjust if we get it wrong.
Very interesting. That's all. Hearing all of that makes me feel a lot better and more optimistic for some reason. So let's hope others feel that way too. So we're approaching the Q&A portion, but I'm going to ask one final question that I think is relevant, and it's kind of an increasingly popular discussion in our space. But I'm curious how current and expected policies and regulations play into how everyone is thinking about and going about integration. And so if it's the case, for example, that one of your companies, for example, expects that there will be a carbon price, maybe that kind of influences which products you'll invest in today. And so I'm curious how that plays in maybe strategically when you're thinking about integration and assessing new products. Is there like a policy and regulation aspect as well, and kind of a planning for different future conditions? And if so, how do you kind of go about that, thinking about that?
Jump in again. So I think to your point about regulatory, I think with our experience in plastics, plastic taxation has caused a sort of an exemplar of how a tax can lead a change, and it's having huge sort of ramifications in the sort of plastics world. So what we see is, I think we're still feeling our way through. We absolutely are advocating for some kind of fair carbon pricing. So our shift towards from black carbon into, as we call it, fossil carbon, into other sources of carbon, renewable, circular. We see from the economic sort of argument that there has to be some kind of carbon pricing, and my boss's boss would even go as far as to say it's not carbon pricing, it's carbon taxation. I'm not sure Unilever's quite been so bold as to make that statement yet. So some mechanism for incentivization is in our thinking, and we've sort of set boundaries around if carbon pricing or whatever, in whatever mechanism to have this value, what does that mean for future supply chain decisions and all the rest of it. But I think honestly, we're just feeling our way through that at the moment. Again, we're a global company and there's different regulations around all over the world. We have a regulation team that are trying to get on top of that to understand US, India, South Asia, China. We have to do everything's different. So that's also factored in as well. But I think we're just getting into that sort of thinking at the moment in terms of long term. We set ourselves, everybody may not be aware, we set ourselves a net zero target for 2039. And of course, then that really does focus the mind to say, rather than it just being an abstract target, it's a, we will be net zero. So one way or the other, we're going to have to pay to achieve net zero. So that really is sort of forcing the decision making around what do you pay for it through your materials footprint and your sort of sourcing decisions, or do you kind of back off on the greenhouse gas reductions for your sourcing decisions and then we'll net zero offset it somewhere else later on. All of that is a very live debate. The sort of carbon regulatory position is part of that thinking. But a work in progress, I think, is the best answer.
Yeah, I'll second what Ian just said. It's a work in progress. I think when I think about this field, I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, it levels the playing field. Big companies like BASF and clearly Unilever have the ability to do what's best, not just for on one axis, the economic law, but also on the societal axis, because we have a long past and we have a wide or long-ranging future, and it's important for us that we are part of a positive impact there. So I also think it makes it a lot easier for consumers if there is some kind of regulation, carbon tax or carbon credit or whatever it might be, because it allows the consumer to not always educate themselves all the time and then be the force that sort of steers the market that way. So I think there's a lot of benefits to some kind of regulation in whatever form it might take. I think we also have to be extremely careful because there's a lot of unintended consequences that we can easily run into, which would actually create a negative side, a negative impact for the society that nobody wants either. So I think it's extremely important that we all work together and come from the fact that we all want the Earth to look even greener in a few years, right? That's what we all want. We want to be able to continue a life that we find comfortable on Earth. We want to be able to have a green future. We want to have a future for our kids. And if we come from that, we can come together and we can create the right environment to create that society that we want for the future.
And I think an example of that, we see the incentivization of the fuel industry for sustainable fuels that we don't have in the chemicals, or at least I don't think we have in the chemical space. And so when we're talking to suppliers, they'll quite often say, well, actually, there's no market for you because the economics don't make sense. All our materials are going to go to aviation fuel because that's where the incentivization is. So I think regulation can drive irritating behavior as well as good behavior if you don't get it right.
Thank you all for those responses. Again, it's making me feel a little better about our future. So now, because we only have about 12 minutes left until the top of the hour, I want to dive into the question or the audience Q&A. And the first one that comes up for me when I'm looking at this is for Marcus. It says for the X Prize, questions concerning I think the questions are questions concerning social impacts taken into account. Or will they be taken into account by the judges? And if so, what is their relative importance? So if you could speak to that.
Thanks for the question. The answer is yes. We think of that under the framework of scalability. In other words, a socially unacceptable solution will never scale. Therefore, under the prove to the judges that you not only have something that works, but that can scale, explain that you, first of all, understand what the barriers are likely to be, And second of all, and ideally, you have at least some thought about how you can tackle them if you can't tackle them on your own, how they might be tackled. So that's a yes. We think it's an important thing to push. This is an example of trying to push the community in that direction, even though we understand it's a hard thing to qualitatively assess. It feels like a big miss to not push for that. So, I mean, that's a long way of saying yes. And I would say it is valued in equal importance to, does it work? Can it achieve low cost? And can your solution scale? Those are our three basic criteria. And social context and justice is wrapped up inside of that.
Perfect. There is another question for Stephen. An anonymous attendee is asking, could you please put into the chat some of the tools that you mentioned regarding decision analysis? So Electra, analytical hierarchy,
yeah.
process, and others.
Yeah, no, that would be no problem. I think Volker did include a link to the worked example that we were talking about. As I said, we very briefly reviewed a number of those as an introductory part of that. And if you follow that link through, it will take you to the sort of work that we did. And in there are much better, more detailed reports than what we could write in around 15 or 20 pages on those MCDA methods. But yes, I won't mind dropping some of the names in there. I mean, what I would suggest would be just to pick your favorite search engine and put in multi-attributional decision making sort of types, and you'll find there are an awful lot of options in there. And depending on the type of data you have and the type of problem you have and your desired output, whether you want to sort of rank everything or whether you just want to find one specific answer from a selection of answers, there is an awful lot of excellent work out there. So yeah, I would personally just I'll drop those sort of words into the chat if people want to find them, but that's what I would do.
Right, I think there's a big Wikipedia page that lists dozens of these methods. So yeah, there's a lot out there. And maybe an idea for us is filming some kind of video or something that kind of really walks through step by step how to use one of these or something. That might be a cool thing for us to work on. So Tim asks, talking about quick scan tools, going back to that discussion, what kinds of questions do you ask yourselves when comparing options, whether they are processes, products, options within process development? How mature are the processes or products that you look at? So I would guess this is probably aimed at Anne and Ian with the quick scan tools in particular, but anyone can feel free to take it.
So like so many other companies, we use a gated approach, meaning that we evaluate and reevaluate the project and the technology we develop at many different levels. So the kind of questions we ask develop with that, and it develops also with what kind of maturity of the market and the product and the technology that we're looking at. So we take anything from extremely mature market doesn't exist yet to extremely mature market and technology are pretty well known but need some kind of tweak. And the questions we ask are individual or directed towards whatever the particular maturity is. Yeah? So when we start out, if there's no research project, as I said, the first question is the line with our strategy, right? And specifically our strategy about biorenewables or recycling of chemicals, or how can we reduce landfill? Is it aligned to those kind of questions? And if it's not, then it doesn't get funded. If it is, and it gets funded, and we are able to develop some new technology, then at some point it's going to be adopted by a business unit, and the business units will ask another set of questions. Yeah, some of them will be around like the societal impact. Some of them will be more focused on cost, of course, manufacturability. Some of them will be focused on regulatory and IP, what have you not. And of course, in all of this is customer, right? So without the customer being interested in it, there's not a path forward. So our customer engagement, even in a research project, is high. I'm sorry, I don't have a more complete answer, but that's the best I can do.
There's another question I thought was quite interesting. Okay, so we have one for an anonymous attendee, and just so everyone knows, we're about 5 minutes from the top of the hour, and we'll switch to the next presentation. But this says, climate change is a symptom of climate injustice that is unfolding in front of our eyes because climate change is causing pain and suffering to the most vulnerable who contributed to the issue the least. In that regard, what are the metrics we should think about when talking about social LCA? So when we're moving beyond just pure environmental impacts and impact categories and moving beyond just assessing cost and profitability and those kinds of things, when we're actually talking about impacts on society, what are the kinds of metrics that all come to mind for, or that come to mind for all of you when your organizations or you do these assessments? You know, what are the specific metrics for social LCA in terms of climate injustice?
We have done some work on sort of social impact assessment, as Katie mentioned. We wrote a paper recently, but our focus was very much on the front end, cradle to gate type impacts, and it was very much around the potential impacts you could avoid during technology development. It's sort of very hard to be able to assess some of these sort of impacts on a larger scale later on in the sort of life cycle of these industries. And we were very much trying to, we used the UNEP guidelines as the basis for our assessment, and we tweaked those to try to fit technology development, specifically CCU technology development. And I'd say one of the blind spots would be this type of work. I think there's certainly a lot of potential in that area to try to understand where this damage has been done, where it currently is being done, and whether we, more importantly, I suppose, in terms of the work we work in specifically, and I'd probably say the same for the other panelists, is how to prevent this happening in the future. You know, how can you mitigate this happening, as well as sort of reporting on what's already there? How can we mitigate it in the future? And that's where we ended up sort of developing our sort of social impact assessment to try to head off some of this, or at least try to head off some of the social impacts that you may have from technology development now. And we plan to have a sort of second go at updating our framework, and this would be a useful thing to add, I suppose, whether there's a way of trying to capture how those impacts can be sort of mitigated. But I would say that they move more into this integrated approach rather than something that you can associate just to society. It's the impact that you have on the environment, which is a function of your costs. You know, if you choose to have a higher environmental impact by driving down your own costs, you know, externalize those costs, you have someone has to pay. So how do we create a one size fits all cost that covers all these elements, and work out where we're externalizing and to what extent we're externalizing is very much I suppose it would be a great thing, a great aspirational goal for us or for anybody else who's working in this area. So I know that there's people in TU Delft that are working on similar things, who may be a little bit further along that. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of an aspirational goal, a one size fits all cost that covers all these costs, the cost of society, the cost of the environment, an actual sustainability cost, would be the best way of addressing this type of problem.
Yeah, and off that, I just saw in the chat, someone said a project was just approved to start development of an ISO international standard on social LCA. Work will begin this summer. So look at that. It's already starting, which is exciting. So with that, we are approaching the top of the hour here. So I'll take a moment to thank all of our esteemed panelists for taking time out of their day to come talk to us about integration, how they think about it, how their organizations think about it. I certainly got a lot of interesting notes and thoughts from this conversation. So yeah, so thank you again, everyone, for participating. And I guess I'll hand it back to Volker at this point to transition to the following webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Grant and everybody on the panel, thank you so much for a very engaging and very inspiring conversation. As Grant, I think, repeatedly emphasized, he's much more optimistic about the future now. And I cannot thank everybody enough for contributing to that. With that, we are moving into part 2, and I'm asking Josh Shadle from NREL to introduce this panel.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Volker?
Yes, it's fine.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to introduce this next group of folks, specifically Nicole Mendoza, as well as Joachim Weber, the two main speakers today. Both of those are colleagues of mine at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Nicole's been there for a fairly short period of time, I think approaching around 2 years now. She works in our wind energy systems department within our National Wind Technology Center. Has been doing a lot of work in the onshore and offshore wind space, but also has in the past explored an environmental entrepreneurs fellowship program looking at CO2 capture and exploration of CO2 utilization. So clearly a nice close alignment with a lot of the interests here today. And Joachim Weber has been with NREL a little bit longer, I think around 7 or 8 years. Works in the Center for Energy Conversion and Storage Systems. And he's actually one of the original developers of this technology performance level assessment methodology that they'll be introducing today and that they've been working on over the last 10 years or so. So excited to get them started, and I think looking forward to a great session. Thanks, Nicole and Joachim, and thank you, Volker.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today, and thank you, Josh, for the great introduction. And also thank you very, very much to Volker Sick for inviting us to be here today. We are very honored to be able to share with you our work in this area. Okay, so today we're going to talk about our research on technology performance level assessment framework for low TRL technologies, and a little bit about how it has been adapted for the CCUS industry. So first, we'll talk about why we're here today and the synergies between the two industries. Then we'll talk a little bit about how TPL was developed and its history and why it's important, how it affects what we call technology development trajectories, which has to do with the course or the process over which a technology is developed throughout its life cycle. So it's limited in scope to a single technology. Then we'll go a little bit into the methodology and the different areas or aspects of TPL and what it can accomplish and its components, and then some examples both in the wave energy industry as well as the CCUS industry, and how we think it could add value and benefit the CCUS industry. So why are we here today? Because we see a lot of similarities and synergies between the wave energy converter community in wave power, which is where Joachim has his expertise, and this assessment methodology has come out of, and the CCUS industry. You know, first of all, they are both there's a plethora of early stage technologies with no dominant technology path. And there's a lot of questions around, okay, well, how do you compare? How do you assess these technologies from a techno-economic, environmental, social, and risk impact perspective? These both industries are fraught with high risks and high uncertainties, high costs, and somewhat slow development timelines. And finally, as we have been discussing throughout this webinar series, there's no clear path for assessing these technologies. And in our early or preliminary conversations with the GCI team, it has become clear that both industries share similar challenges and risks and uncertainties in evaluating these technologies. Finally, I would like to comment that the technology performance level assessment framework very clearly follows the same benefits as TEA and LCA in terms of identifying hotspots and design drivers, in terms of providing organizations like the X Prize or the Department of Energy or other funding agencies and investors with comparative assessments of which technologies to fund, but most importantly, it helps the developers of these technologies identify the different risks and be able to target consciously different areas of their design with their resources. So with that, I will hand it over to Jakob.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And I want to strengthen again the thanks of being invited to speak in this community. And it's great to see from the other presentations that there's so much good thinking and important thing going on how to deal with uncertainty and all the different values and goals that we're trying to pursue. So I want to say a few words a bit about the background of TPL, technology performance levels. It came out of a situation when I was working in a startup developing wave energy technology, and very much the investment and the pull and the push from all directions was around technology readiness levels. And that led, and we've heard this in other presentations, that led to certain challenges with not maybe always making the right decisions on how to develop the technology. So a desire came up to find a way on how to communicate at the earliest possible stage what the promise of a technology is. So that was then formulated back in 2012 in the first presentation, in the first publication. Within NREL, we've had a Wave Energy Prize, which was quite a large effort, around 8 million in total, where there was the challenge to have an open entry for basically typical for prizes for everybody to be able to join in. At the same time, we needed a means to identify out of around 90 submissions what are promising concepts. So it was important to very early look at drivers, not even understanding by any means of accuracy what the potential will be in the future, but to understand drivers of good cost and performance at an early stage. We then later on went through a much more sophisticated process of stakeholder engagement and life cycle assessment to refine our tool much more detailed. And it has grown, and in the meantime now we have it as a web-based version. And over this period, the way of thinking about technology development is really something that has found a lot of resonance within our domain as well as outside of the domain, and that's why we feel it might be useful to share some of the thinking. Thank you. So can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so here's a very playful slide with some technology concepts in a very simplistic way, but I hope you can see the animation. This just is supposed to characterize that wave energy really is an area with many different ideas, many different approaches. So you have heaving buoys on the top left. I'll just go through the row. And you have something like hinging barges, then bottom hinged flaps. You could have moving bodies, which have an internal reference, like the rotating mass. Then there's a whole new domain of flexible wave energy converters that don't accumulate forces onto hinges or single degrees of freedom. On the bottom left, you could have fully submerged devices. Then you have something referred to as oscillating water column, where you actually drive airflow through a turbine due to the water flow. Then you have overtopping devices, and you have also devices that work with fast motion and lift. So this really speaks to, we have a lot of ideas going around here, and it's not that obvious to compare them. Next slide, please. So here, a little bit of reality to these concepts. This is also, again, only a small snapshot On the top left, you see a US developer who has been around for a long time and has now a product out there at relatively small scale. Then AWS on the middle left here is just going to be deployed at the European Marine Energy Test Center, which is a volume changing device, fully submerged. Then we have technologies that use bellows to push internal flow through turbines. This technology is currently being manufactured and is soon going to be deployed outside of Wales. Then up here we have, oh, I'm actually moving my mouse and I'm not sharing stuff. I should say the names. We have Core Power on the top left here, which is a heaving buoy, which is a very clever control algorithm. In the middle, Ocean Energy, you see some floating oscillating water columns. And you see the round elements are the turbine exits. On the top right, you see a former Scottish company with multi-element hinged barge, and just under it, the yellow device Motion is, you could call it an offspring of it, because the first company is not in operation anymore. And then to close out at the bottom right, you have a large construction of a bottom hinged flap, which was also deployed in Scotland in the Marine Energy Center. Next slide, please. So how to communicate technology development is really at the core of the TPL. And as I mentioned, very much technology development by investment and by goals, and formulating of goals was driven by technology readiness levels. And the technology readiness levels, only in secondary sense, at least in our domain, clearly talk about how good a technology is. They very much talk about how close is the technology to becoming a product. But it's a secondary thought on if that product will actually survive in the marketplace or enter the marketplace. So the thought came up, well, maybe these are two independent aspects, and we should think about them independently and draw this two-dimensional map on how ready is the technology to being a product and what is its potential to becoming a good product, so being economical. So we use then this map to communicate our thinking about technology development. Next slide, please. And of course, you can think about very generic ways on how to move around. Let's say we start with an idea at the bottom left and we don't know really how good it is. So we could either have many different ideas and many iterations competing at low technology readiness level and try and improve our technology in the low technology readiness level domain, which of course would be fast and beautiful, but is also challenging because it's prone to a huge amount of uncertainty. If we go the yellow route, that means we are very much scaling up, building larger prototypes and gaining experience, but maybe going into bottlenecks and into cul-de-sacs that we find very hard to get out of. So somewhere in between might be a realistic path. Thanks. And next slide, please. Then another fundamental thought about this, of course, is what to do when. And a critical question is, when should we challenge and change fundamentals of a concept and be flexible about it? And when should we not do this anymore? And of course, it appears obvious that from a certain development readiness level on, fundamentals cannot really be changed anymore because the demonstration projects are complex processes with subcontracts and many parties playing on it, and everything needs to be aligned to deliver. But what is not always lived fully is to truly challenge the fundamentals at an earlier stage when we still have this opportunity. And this, of course, has to do with IP and business models. And yeah, the point really here is that fundamentals need to be changed as long as you still can do that. And those fundamental changes, they may lead to significant changes in the potential of the technology. And next slide, please. So where are we now? So over the years, we've looked at many different cases on what happened in technology development. We've developed the tool to try and assess by looking at our cost and performance drivers, what the promise of technology is. And we've identified that it is more promising to, as much as possible, to work in the low TRL realm and improve the promise of the technology as much as possible before the technology is matured out. And this is particularly, of course, the case when we have long development times of many years and high cost intensive and associated with a lot of risk. And what we're trying to do as a national lab is to support industry on the one hand side with tools to, and the service to assess their technology, to provide the tools so they can use the tool for their own assessments in a confidential way, of course. And we also use TPL and the work around it, and I'll come to that a little bit later, for innovation. So we use those cost and performance drivers to spark innovation and improve on concepts. And that's what we're trying to do with the project on the left-hand side, where we want to come up with technology concepts that have high promise and provide them in a non-exclusive manner to industry for development. And next slide, please. So in summary, from the learnings over the years, some fundamental statements here. It really has shown that it is very important to fully embrace the challenge. The full understanding of the problem statement and asking more questions than or leaning on asking a question more than maybe necessary, but not forgetting one, is really, truly very important. So fully understand the problem statement, and with that, often also the opportunity statement that lies within that. So to engage with all stakeholders and identify all functional requirements over the whole life cycle is truly important to start with. And next, thank you. Then also to ignite innovation and renovation. I think I've been using the word renovation in recent years again, because we are recognizing some old values in these times, I think, and so the renovation is not only associated with the ideas to solve problems, but also how to think about it and what the values are. And how to drive innovation both with methodologies, which we do with techniques for inventive problem solving, but also, of course, in an intuitive way. And next one, please. And of course, at all times to engage assessment in an intensive way, with an emphasis on uncovering the unknowns, particularly unknown unknowns. And we all know how painful and devastating it for development can be to not uncover unknown unknowns and make them known unknowns, and then to make sure that they are not becoming neglected known unknowns. And in that effort, it truly is has shown to be more valuable to think of inclusiveness and think of holistic capture of all aspects rather than of accuracy. And next one, please. Yeah, and then choosing a path, how to move around on this map that we just discussed, and how to make decisions whereby robustness against failure is often of greater value than working in the domain where we know a lot about and increasing our accuracy in that. And be agile and responsive. And sometimes IP is valuable hidden here, and sometimes it can also be an addictive drug. And yeah, and the advantages then can be to be effective with respect to cost, time, and risk, which turns out to be more likely to achieve success. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Nicole. Oh, I have one more. Okay, thank you. Yeah, we also did over the years accumulate data from our domain in wave energy and looked at technology development times, costs, and success in the domain. And you see here three very simple generic technology development trajectories. So the red one goes towards going towards larger TRLs and in a fast way, and then trying to move up to improve the technology at high technology readiness levels. The green one is the other path that we identified earlier and mentioned we feel is more promising. So to first try and improve the promise before you mature the technology. And the black one is one where the starter at the onset, identical route to the red path was taken, but then it was recognized that a fundamental change needed to be made in the technology. And this was made, and one needed to go back to low TRL activities. And when you look at the table, you see very, very stark differences in terms of cost. And we're talking here about differences between 150 million or 65 million for technology development to arrive at TRL 8.9 and the meaningful performance. Times are very large, between 10 and 20 years. And the risk, we're using here a bit of a funny unit, but the risk, it's more about the magnitude, is substantially larger when you go the red route. And the corner at the bottom right has been quite a bit of a graveyard from some technology developments. So yeah, that's me for now. Back to Nicole.
Okay, thank you so much, Joachim, for highlighting some of the benefits of TPL for single technology development trajectories. I wanted to change tack a little bit since we've been talking so much about technology performance levels. What exactly are they? How are they calculated? And how can this be applied to the CCUS industry? So first and foremost, a technology performance level is a holistic and integrated techno-economic assessment technology framework that can quantify a technology's performance, economic, environmental, social, and safety and risk impacts. And the idea here is that it includes the TEA and LCA aspects, but it can also include a wide variety of social, safety, and risks impacts in the assessment methodology to create this holistic framework. So what exactly do we mean by that? So TPL has the ability to take into account everything that we've been talking about so far in this webinar series, as well as additional things like use integration, markets and location, social impacts, and safety and risks. And these things are combined in a quantitative manner into a single score or metric that is very similar to TRL in that it's a scale of 1 to 9, and the different levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 are very similar to how TRLs are categorized. And so it's very analogous, which is what enables it to be plotted against TRL in the way that Joachim just showed. And so on the one hand, it can be a somewhat beautiful thing in that you have a single score, but then what does this score really mean? And we will talk about that coming up. Some of the interesting and valuable things about TPL are that it can incorporate all relevant design and impact drivers, even if they are qualitative or immeasurable. So a lot of our initial discussions focused around safety impacts, risks, and uncertainties. And one of the benefits of this framework is that you can incorporate that into the assessment, provide some guidance for how that question is to be scored, and then that allows it to be made into a quantitative value that can then be mathematically combined with the other question scores to create the capability scores and then eventually the final TPL metric. So yeah, just to make sure it's very clear that TPL can take into account qualitative and immeasurable design drivers. Another benefit is that it can address some of the design trade-offs between the techno-economic performance and the environmental performance of the technology through different weights, which can be driven or were decided by the stakeholder community based on what is relatively important to them. And this can help with some of the issues that were asked by the community at one of Volker's Air Miners conference things about, okay, well, how do you weight the environmental performance versus the economic performance, and how do you decide between them, and which is more important, and things like that. So those are some of the benefits of this methodology. Okay, in terms of taking into account some of these other things, just wanted to talk about the kinds of things that we currently consider in these different categories or areas or aspects, but this list is not comprehensive, and it is fully adaptable to the CCUS community and can be tailored to your application. So on the social impact side, the two primary areas are job creation and use conflicts. And one of the biggest things to keep in mind from this TPL assessment is that we have done our best to make it as site agnostic as possible and as technology agnostic as possible. And that has had an impact on how we judge the social impacts of a technology, particularly because sites that would benefit more from the technology, such as building of infrastructure, or, for example, providing power where there didn't previously exist power, such as in Africa, which would then in turn have human health impacts, you know, as compared to sites like the US, where, okay, it's just another option and the infrastructure is already there, you know, and so making it site agnostic has really limited the ability, our ability to measure and quantify the social impact. So that's definitely an area that we're looking for feedback and improvement and further discussion on. In terms of safety and risks, these are a bit more quantifiable, as you can calculate the uncertainty in the scores as well as the assessment methodology itself. And you can take into account all kinds of risks, financial risks, survivability and reliability risks, availability risks, supply chain risks. I mean, the world is your oyster at this point. You can really ask just about any kind of question on risk that you feel is appropriate and is in accordance with your stakeholder community. Another area that we feel is fairly important to both industries is use integration and how that affects the system that it is coupled to. So for example, in the wave energy community, the WEC is very commonly feeding power to something. If it's an ocean observation device, if it's underwater vehicles, if it's passing ships or whatever. In the CCUS case, it's how the carbon capture system affects the power plant that it is attached to, or the source of emissions that it is attached to, if it's an ethanol plant or whatever. What kind of power draw does it take? What kind of bleed does it put on the system that it's attached to? So this category allows you to take those kinds of impacts into account, as well as any ancillary benefits that the WEC or CCUS system might provide to the system it's attached to. And then finally, this assessment framework allows you to take into account the wide variety or narrow size of the markets that are relevant to that particular technology. So for example, in the CCUS community, you know, which plants can it be attached to? Does it require high CO2 content in the streams like ethanol plants, or can the technology be applicable and relevant to lower CO2 containing waste streams, such as those from coal and natural gas plants, and as well as other things? So you can take into account the applicable and relevant markets size for that technology, which again contributes to measuring the technology's potential. The more markets it can serve, the higher the potential of the technology. Okay, I will hand it over to Joachim.
Hey, thanks, Nicole. Here's one more slide, which I just want to use to describe the process that we used, which is, I'm sure you're more familiar with that in your discipline than we might be. We initially started out with a set of cost and performance drivers, and after some time, after the wave energy prize, we had this very concerted effort to go through a very detailed, very intensive life cycle assessment, and looking at all stakeholder requirements at all stages, which ended up to be a huge, huge chessboard. And so we defined the capabilities of what the system is supposed to be and the functions, what it's supposed to do, and match these to each other. And also try to find metrics for the individual functional requirements. And the main point of this slide here is, apart from that, these functions and capabilities are then supposed to meet the mission statement, but that we set out to do at a very high level at the beginning. This set of functions and capabilities in our work drives two processes. On the one hand side, which is more the focus of today, is the assessment, so that we have the TPL assessment growing out of the capabilities and the metrics that are all associated with it. And currently we have about 100 questions that we look at in order to assess the technology performance levels of technologies. But the point I want to make here is that these functions, they of course immediately also represent trade-offs. You want something and something else, and they usually don't go together, and they express contradictions and challenges. And they can also very much drive the innovation process. And what we have found very useful, apart from intuitive and other innovation methods, is to use structured innovation with techniques for inventive problem solving. And the acronym TRIZ is a Russian acronym, and yeah, translated it's techniques for inventive problem solving, is a methodology that directly hinges around identifying a contradiction and a key trade-off, and trying to not limit the solution finding to finding the sweet spot or the compromise, but instead to break a compromise, not to be compromised, and truly innovate your way out of a contradiction. And we feel that this, in terms of the whole picture, how do you move around in technology development, you need to have innovative steps all along. It's not just something at the beginning. And it's always good then to use those functional requirements to identify and be clear about the trade-offs and the contradictions, and try and dissolve them. And that's the message for the slide here, that we have these two processes, assessment and innovation. Thank you.
Okay, so as Joachim just pointed out and discussed, the fundamental core of the TPL methodology is that you start with this systems engineering framework that describes how your technology meets the mission requirements. And you couple that to these capabilities that are defined by your stakeholders. And so it is essential and critical to have stakeholder engagement to help define what these capabilities are that the technology must meet, and how they are weighted and scored. Once you have developed the capabilities for the technology or domain, you can then create functions or derive functions that for the technology, in order for the technology to meet these capabilities. Once you have defined your functions, you can then derive the individual assessment questions, which form the backbone of the methodology. In terms of the different components of the methodology, you have the questions, which again are by far the most important piece and are what the developer and the stakeholders primarily interact with. You can choose or adapt the question wording, the scoring guidance for that question, which is usually low, medium, and high. And you can choose whether or not to include certain questions or add questions based on your stakeholder guidance. Then these questions are weighted into their categories and subcategories, sub-subcategories, etc. and then each level of category is then rolled up mathematically using these expressions on the right, various types of means, into the final capability scores, which are then mathematically combined to create your final TPL score. Again, wanted to drive home that this methodology is both technology agnostic and site agnostic. Okay. All right. Here we're going to show a very brief example from the wave energy space, but then I will jump into a CCUS example next. So shown here on the left is a reference model, WEC technology that is being evaluated, and based on our methodology and subject matter expertise, we have determined that it has a TPL of 5.4 on a scale of 1 to 9, again, analogous to TRL. However, this score does not necessarily tell you very much unless it's compared to some sort of baseline or reference technology. So what we did was we took that one level lower and presented the 7 capabilities that are shown here in the spider chart on the right. And what that enables you to do is to see what areas does the technology shine in, and what areas is the technology deficient in. And this type of spider chart is used very widely in the LCA community for the different types of environmental impacts. And so I figured that it would be the most appropriate representation of the salient results for this community. And as shown here, highlighted in green and red, this type of methodology can identify both the strengths and the weaknesses of the technology, where resources and funding would be most appropriate to invest in, and overall allow you to compare the different technologies on the different scales. Okay. Again, following the methodology, bringing it into the CCUS domain, you combine your systems engineering framework with your stakeholder engagement to create the capabilities. And so what I've done here is I've tried to create analogs between the two industries, and based on my understanding of the CCUS community, what kinds of capabilities could be included, of course, with subject matter experts in the CCUS community, adapting them however you wish. So the primary performance metric of the CCUS system is how much CO2 and of what purity, so the quality and the quantity of carbon dioxide the system will capture. For the wave energy community, it's the quality and quantity of the power generated by the system. So you have your primary performance metric, and then on top of that, you have the cost of the concept, you have the environmental impacts, how it integrates to the systems it's connected to, safety risks, social impacts, and the size of its applicable and relevant markets. So those would be the capabilities that, say, for example, go here on the axes of your spider chart. And then from your capabilities, you derive the functions that the technology must meet. These are like the design requirements, so to speak. And so here I showed some that, again, are relevant to the CCUS domain, just to give some examples of what they could be. But again, subject matter experts can feel free to adapt this however you wish. And then from the functions, the individual assessment questions are derived. So here is just a brief summary and overview of the different things that we've talked about today and the different benefits that TPL offers. And we will now open it up for discussion, and we will take some questions.
I have some questions.
Joachim, thank you so much. I asked you to handle the flow of the questions yourself, so I will stay out of it.
Okay, but please feel free when we're missing things here in the tool. So I see one question here, and I think it's gone now because it answered it. It's about assessing at a very early stage, and how can one be sure about the validity of the assessment. My experience is that, let's be provocative, accuracy and quantification is overrated. which often leads to the fact that decisions are not made when before a certain accuracy level is reached. I think the assessment at an early stage can reach a level of accuracy by being holistic, by identifying possible showstoppers and avoiding that these showstoppers lead to a breakdown of the entire development. And that may be possible at a relatively high uncertainty or inaccuracy. And the downside to miss it is so huge that we feel it's very important to look at the holistic assessment as early as possible. And the other element to that is that what we find very difficult is how to bring these cost and performance drivers that feed into the assessment together. So what does the overall score look like? How do these factors come together? That's a very difficult question. And with the TPL assessment, we've gone the way to say, if we have to make a choice between the accuracy of our formula or our simulation behind it, say like levelized cost of energy is a totally secure, definite formula, but the input might be uncertain. We said we do not limit the input and the questions based on the fact that we don't know how to put them together. It's more important to have them all there. And of course, that is embracing uncertainty in the big time. I hope that helps to answer that question.
Just to add on briefly to what Joachim said, there is a way in the assessment itself, as in the questions that the developers fill out with using their data, to incorporate some uncertainty into those questions or their sureness of their answers. So let's say a developer would, based on the question or scoring guidance, rate themselves a 5. They can say, well, I'm relatively confident in this grade that I'm giving myself, and here is the uncertainty band, plus minus 1. But they can also say, okay, well, I give myself a 4, but I'm not quite sure where I fall, or this variable is changing all the time, and so I'm going to give it a relatively high uncertainty. So there is a direct way for, as the data is input into the spreadsheet or the web application, to quantify the uncertainty there. Joachim, I'm going to feed you some questions. So one of the questions has to do with this slide, and they would like to know, could you please explain the units that you used for risk here? What does this dollars per million?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I was looking at the time, we were looking at a way on how to express risk of failure of technology development, which goes beyond accumulating and adding up and integrating sequences of risk, but where also the risk is associated with going from one step to the next. So the unit here is coming out of risk being a factor of likelihood and probability and impact of failure. And the impact, we just said, okay, there's 2 levels of impact. One is the time that's lost, and the other one is the money that's lost. And we look at them separately. And if both is lost, it's the worst case. That's we multiplied them, and the probability doesn't show up as a unit clearly, but is embedded in how those different paths sequence through the map. I hope that helps. And I'm sure there are better ways, and I'd love to learn a better way on how to quantify the accumulated risk through technology development. And I'd be happy to find ideas from people present here.
Okay, we have another question about what the differences are. Could you please explain what the differences are between the capabilities and the functions?
Okay, yeah, this is a kind of, sometimes there's a big overlap and sometimes it's a subtle aspect. Maybe one example is a capability is to be safe, but a function then is a certain action that the system needs to do. It needs to perform a certain activity to support that capability of being safe. So it is something also we found difficult in the process when we were introduced to get used to, but in some cases it has shown beneficial to distinguish between what the system is supposed to be, which is a step further away from the invention. You'd really just think of the quality of what it's supposed to be. And then as the next step, as you think about functions, and there you have to be careful to make sure that these functions are formulated also in a very agnostic way so that it doesn't preempt a solution. Hope that gives
so, like, for an example, on a wind turbine, a design driver or a capability might be operate safely, but the ways in which it accomplishes this are the functions. So things like emergency stop system, controller features, the brake pad, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that helps with capabilities versus functions. Okay, we have some more questions. So the idea of advancing a technology to near market readiness levels while it continues with poor performance seems like a strange concept in general and somewhat counterintuitive. Why would a company do this? Does this happen often in practice? Are there any examples? So I think that kind of gets back to this plot here about the red trajectory, or your plot here about the orange one. You know, why would someone do the orange path?
Yeah, absolutely good question. And I fully agree with your question, and I've asked myself the same thing often. You know, the reasons for driving towards higher technology readiness level, and that means different things in different technologies. In wave energy, because wave energy systems are, if you want to look at large energy production impact, are somewhat either linked to the wave period or to the wavelength. So in the end, they end up being large, and downscaling, the physics doesn't allow you to demonstrate your system in a real environment at a very small scale. Very often, depends a bit on the technology and the concept. So unfortunately, the money from the private as well as from the public sector traditionally has come from delivering on showing how at higher technology readiness levels. And this is where companies have been pushing themselves to, and companies have been pushed towards. And if you've been engaged with investors, very often you will not be in the room for very long when you are at TRL 3, but you will be listened to when you are at TRL 6. As simple as that might sound. And so unfortunately, cost drivers, expectation, demonstration, and often taking shortcuts has driven several developments towards pushing that route. And yeah, there have been significant setbacks. So you're right, why should they do it? Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really good question. I would argue that historically, sometimes technology developers get so wrapped up in the technology development and maybe the technical performance that they lose sight of the environmental impacts, the social impacts, and these things just aren't considered during the design process. And, you know, this community here understands that, you know, that is no longer really acceptable, and that we are pushing in both of our domains, technology developers to consider these other design factors when developing their technologies. Okay, the next question says, the methodology looks good, but he has a question about the assessment questions. How do you assess the question quality? And depending on how you word the questions, you may get very different answers.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is also very true, and a very well, let's put it like this. So I'll give you an example. We have questions on on how you deploy or manufacture a technology. And some technologies are much better manufactured at a central location and then transported. For others, it makes perfect sense to manufacture them close to the shore and a harbor. And then questions about how you go about these things might be very contradictory. And it is truly challenging to remain technology agnostic, but to be concrete enough to formulate meaningful questions. And I don't really have a solution for this. My only recommendation is that the assessment process of a complicated problem statement is just as complicated as the problem statement itself. And I've seen in my background quite often that assessment, there's a certain disengagement from some assessment aspects because of the complexity, but the complexity remains in the system and then is maybe not observed and not tracked. So I can only say, yes, it's very difficult, but it's better to do it and to maybe not do it that well than not to do it.
I would like to provide a little bit more concrete of an answer, because we have been going through this process fairly recently as we adapt the assessment methodology to other applications within wave energy, such as current energy converters and other domains. And our overall process for doing this is that we have subject matter experts in-house for these different technologies that formulate the questions and wording based on achieving specific goals with that question. So you're targeting a specific design aspect of the technology and breaking questions up into trying to get at the different aspects. And then you, based on literature and kind of industry numbers, you create the scoring guidance, which allows you to quantify the answer or the result to the question. And that's usually broken down into low, medium, and high, 1 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, respectively. And then the scoring guidance and the question wording are then reviewed by the stakeholders. So in this case, it would be our technology developers, it would be the Marine Energy Alliance and external global organizations, it could be universities. The stakeholder community can be fairly large, but again, we want to benefit the developers. So it's best to involve them in the process as well. So you derive the question and then you review it with your stakeholders, which I think is where the GCI really excels, is they have direct access to the stakeholder community, which can also help verify the weights of the individual questions and the capabilities. Okay, the next question is there any paper on what you've presented on the TPL framework and using it for CCUS projects? So the answer is yes, and in work. So as we have shown before, we have probably half a dozen to a dozen different papers on using the assessment methodology and framework within the wave energy space over the last decade, and we are happy to share those upon request. Please feel free to contact us. We can put our contact information in the chat. In terms of expanding it to a CCUS project, that is my Q4 deliverable for this year. So expect that coming out later this year. Let's see. The next question is, thank you for the insightful presentation of the TPL framework. Number one, how do you handle sensitivity and identify key influential factors for the technology?
Yeah, very good question again. So one thing that we've tried to do is, of course, established in the sectors as in every other sector, is levelized cost of energy and the processes and how to go about it. And we've done some work on saying in order to question our TPL assessment and particularly the quantification of it, we need to have some kind of a matchup. So if we say the TRL9, for example, is a technology that is competitive in the market without any short-term or long-term support mechanisms and across all renewable energy types or across all energy types. If that's the definition, then this must be reflected somehow in an LCOE. So we've had quite a lot of work done on trying to match up in test cases. We looked at the system and we did an LCOE analysis, and we did a TPL assessment, and we looked how it matched up, and we adjusted our TPL assessment in the quantification of the simple algorithmics behind it and the weighting factors. So that's one thing we've done. Then in collaboration with the university, they have done some sensitivity analysis, and our fear was that when you look at uncertainties of the inputs, that the system will basically blow up and you have a huge uncertainty coming out in your total score. It hasn't been as dramatic as we thought. It's actually been not as, I couldn't say sensitive here. It's not been as poor in the statements as we expected. And yeah, and we have done some work where we identified and adjusted when we felt this was right or wrong, the influence of particular aspects in the systems by changing our weighting, by changing, I should say, the algorithm, algorithm is the logarithmics behind it. So we'll be using not just weighted means in different groups, but also different other ways, other means and other formulas on how to bring those different scores together. Nicole, am I?
Okay. Since we have about 5 minutes left, I would like to take a quick moment to poll the audience because we feel very strongly that we would very much like to collaborate, that we would like to share what we have learned and also learn from y'all. You know, we would like to build some connections and some relationships and figure out how best our methodology can serve you and your community. What will work best? What are some challenges that we share that we can address together, and things of the like. And so just in the spirit of collaboration, we would like to ask a couple of questions. So first and foremost, if just a really quick and easy one, what results format would be the most useful for the CCUS community? Will it be the single TPL value, or maybe something like the spider chart that I showed in the example, or would it be something else? Please use the Zoom poll, and Christy, if you could please set that up, that would be great. If you feel that some other way to display the results would be more valuable, please put that in the chat, and we are happy to review that and seriously consider it.
Yeah, and so it looks like the majority is voting for spider charts to have visibility on the individual aspects, and I think that's very much also our feeling. There's often even a kind of an apprehension of even bringing things together to a single score, because it implies a non-existing simplification of the problem. So I think there's always a great care to be taken in single scores in such complex arrangements. And I would agree with the voting here, or support that as well.
Totally. Okay, and then I think we have time for one more question. Joachim, do you prefer this one or this one?
Oh, go for it. Maybe the one
okay.
within the...
For the audience and the CCUS community, do you feel that there are any particular adaptations to this methodology or framework that you feel would benefit your community the most? And please feel free to use the chat function And again, we're very open and to feedback, and really want to learn from y'all and work together to help each other.
I think we have covered pressing questions. We have had a very engaging discussion round. Really appreciate both you and Nicole and Joachim for this inspiring presentation, broadening the domain space for our assessments. And I certainly look forward to continuing conversations. We have reached the end of our allocated meeting time, but I think the engagement of the audience shows how we have critically addressed everybody's needs and interests. So with that, I'd like to conclude today's webinar with an outlook on to next week, where we have the final of these webinars for this month of May. We will talk about a preview of the guidelines that were mentioned several times today, and we hope that you will all join us for this. For now, thank you again for being here with us today, and feel free to check into our YouTube channel in the next week or two for a recording of today's webinar. Thank you again, and have a good rest of the day, or if it happens to be tomorrow for you already, have a wonderful tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.